This is the SACOG 2019 Housing Legislative Update webinar. This is Greg Chew with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. Today we have Eric Phillips with Goldfarb and Lipman, who's going to be giving an update on legislative changes the last couple of years in the California legislature and what it means specifically to local governments. We will be covering things that have happened in the last couple of years, and then towards the end, he'll be covering kind of current topics that are being discussed right now at the legislature. So I'm going to review his biography. He's, again, an attorney with Goldfarb, Lipman, LLP, practicing in areas of land use, CEQA, compliance, community development, and housing law. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Eric worked as an urban planning consultant. He currently serves as the Vice President for Policy and Legislation for the California chapter of the American Planning Association. Mr. Phillips currently represents clients in all phases of the development process, including entitlement and administrative approvals, CEQA compliance, and fair housing compliance. He also serves as special counsel to numerous public agencies and provides advice on writing ordinances and legislative findings related to zoning, subdivisions, inclusionary housing programs, and impact fees. Mr. Phillips is an undergraduate planning degree from Cornell University and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. So with that, and just one thing, we should, for those that are watching this live, the webinar will show the slides that he'll be doing. We'll also post the PowerPoint on the SACOG website at a later point. Thank you, Eric.
Great. Well, thank you, Greg, for the introduction. I even got to hear it twice. That's always fun. But as you mentioned, the legislature over the last few years has made substantial changes that affect housing and planning laws. Some of the changes focus on streamlining residential housing production. There's been a big focus on promoting upzoning and being more interested in housing production, moving away from paper planning exercises and trying to hold jurisdictions accountable for housing production on the ground. And these trends taken together have led to very significant changes in housing element law, both in the way the documents themselves are prepared and in the way the regional housing need is allocated to drive the preparation of the housing element law, but also on the back end with the no net loss provisions, again, holding jurisdictions accountable for production that was projected in the housing element, not just for the number of units, but at the actual income levels that were planned for. And then these two planning exercises together have fed into current planning in the form of the Housing Accountability Act and other streamlining legislation. And one of the focuses that has emerged from that piece of legislation is a focus on objective standards. So both as current projects are being reviewed and as jurisdictions are planning for future housing development, they need to be mindful of really relying on objective standards. And that leaves open the question, well, what does that mean? How do I do that? So those are all topics that we're going to be working our way through during today's discussion. And I will pause at a few different points so that we can see if there's any questions from the people that are listening live, anything that needs to be clarified, and we'll continue on. We're scheduled to go for an hour and a half here so people can budget their time appropriately.
And while we're just talking about that, so if there are comments, questions, just type them into the webinar, into the chat, and we'll get your questions. If you're having any technical difficulties, again, send it through that way. That way we'll check in with you. We'll fix any technical issues if you're having problems hearing or anything like that. All right.
Great. So although I'm sure, especially given our particular audience, I'd imagine that most of you already know something about housing elements, but I did want to review a few key concepts so that the new policy changes that we'll be reviewing throughout this webinar make sense and that we're starting from a common understanding. So the key driving force behind housing element law is for a city or a county to show that they have enough land that's zoned for housing at appropriate densities to accommodate the regional housing need allocation, or the RHNA. And we're going to be talking a lot about RHNA today. The housing element is updated in cycles. Currently, it's an 8-year planning period, and the housing element needs to demonstrate how it will accommodate the RHNA during the 8-year planning period. We're currently in the 5th cycle of housing elements, and the 6th cycle update here in the SACOG region is coming due in just a couple of years. And one of the themes, too, that I'll be talking about is how quickly that date is approaching, and that to the extent that it's possible for jurisdictions to start their planning efforts now, we definitely recommend that you do so. Another key component of housing elements and the RHNA allocation is the way that RHNA is divided by income category. And actual affordability requirements will vary greatly by jurisdiction, but on average, statewide, about 40% of units are allocated to low and very low income households, 20% for moderate income households, and 40% for above moderate income households. So in a made-up model city jurisdiction with 1,000 units of RHNA, they would have to plan for 400 units at that lower income category, 200 units for moderate, and 400 units for above moderate income. And the way that they demonstrate that they can accommodate that RHNA is by doing an inventory of sites that are available and including that in the housing element. The inventory has to show the zone that can accommodate the housing that's expected, as well as the density. And the default density of 30 dwelling units per acre here in our region is what's used to be deemed appropriate for lower income households. Lower densities than that can be used for moderate and above moderate income households. But taken together, the inventory is required to identify specific sites, their capacity for future development based on the zoning and other site constraints, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then again, based on the density, what income category those sites are appropriate for. And the two columns that I have here highlighted in orange, the number of units and the income category for which those units are deemed appropriate, has become very important in complying with the no net loss provisions. And we'll talk about specifically why that is and what that means in just a little bit. Two other pieces that I wanted to talk about, just as in way of background, one other piece is the rezoning obligation that jurisdictions have. If the inventory shows that there is not enough sites that are available to accommodate the RHNA, the housing element has to identify sites in the inventory that will be rezoned as part of a program to make those sites available. Jurisdictions have between 3 and 4 years, depending on specific findings, to complete the rezoning program. But at the end of the day, the takeaway is that if your inventory does not show adequate capacity for sites that are deemed appropriate for housing development, you will be obligated to upzone those sites to accommodate the default densities. And a new provision within the last 2 years is that the sites that are rezoned have to then permit by right development for any project that has at least 20% of its housing dedicated for lower income households. And what a use by right means that you have to have no CEQA review. However, you can continue to apply objective design standards as long as the design review process does not constitute a project for CEQA purposes. So it's a specific definition in housing element law for what a use by right is on these rezoned parcels. And it's a little bit different than some of the other streamlining bills. So I just wanted to highlight this obligation. The other concept that's important to understand here is the 20% low income requirement. This is a new addition to the law within the last 2 years. And frankly, it's a little unclear about how that would be applied if the jurisdiction already allows uses by right or housing as a use by right at the densities. So the intent here is, I think, looking back at the legislative history and the discussion that went into creating this requirement was that it would create a fast-track process that was supposed to be easier than the jurisdiction's typical housing processes, and in exchange, the developer would have to provide at least 20% lower income units. If the jurisdiction is already providing residential use by right within a zone, this 20% lower income requirement would actually potentially be a constraint on development by increasing their development standards. But the legislation isn't entirely clear that you can waive that 20% requirement. I think it's going to require a little discussion with HCD. If you're in a jurisdiction that already allows uses by right, whether or not you have to then require those parcels that are identified in your housing element to have a 20% low income requirement. I think that you could definitely read the statute to require that. So that's an area to continue to track and think about. So those are some of the foundational concepts of the housing element that we wanted to start from. And then I do want to turn a little bit to the RHNA allocation process itself.
Maybe we should, if there's any questions on that first part of just checking in to see whether or not we get any chat comments. Nothing?
I thought we could unmute themselves.
Okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next section here.
Yeah, and as we're going to, if questions come up, continue to use that chat feature, and we'll build in some other pauses as we go. So the RHNA allocation process is both the statewide and the regional process to allocate RHNA to the cities and counties. And the process for coming up with the RHNA that then must be accommodated in the housing element was revised last year by two bills, AB 1771 and SB 828. And as a result, we expect that the RHNA throughout the region, or throughout every region in the state, will be higher than it's been in the past because of some of those changes to the methodology. I mean, one, it's highlighted here on the slide, is that RHNA is no longer looking simply at projected household growth. The methodology now also explicitly includes existing overcrowding and cost burdens that existing households face. And that information is being added to the need in addition to the projected growth of the region. So that combination is expected to yield an increase of RHNA allocation. I've heard from some HCD webinars that they expect roughly an 18% increase, but some jurisdictions could see increases even larger than that based just on this factor alone. Another new change is that the final determination of regional need, the numbers themselves that the COGs will be allocating, now have to be approved by HCD. Other factors that I wanted to spend a little bit of time that are new and that have to be considered as RHNA is being distributed by the COG are the impact on housing and its ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this is going to move more housing opportunities closer both to transit and to employment centers, in addition to in an effort to use the housing policy to reduce vehicle miles traveled and have a positive effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Even more explicitly relating housing to jobs is this concept of affordable housing balance and looking to have more affordable housing opportunities in areas where there's demand for low-wage jobs, services, and manufacturing, warehousing, anywhere where there's a low-wage job sector can expect to see its need for affordable housing be increased through this methodology. And there's another new concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing that has to be considered when the housing units are being distributed through the RHNA process. And we'll talk a little bit more explicitly about what that means in just a couple of slides. But in general, I think it's going to create pressure to put more housing at higher densities in high opportunity areas, places that have good schools, access to new opportunities that maybe are traditionally more low density or resistant to higher density housing opportunities. But the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing and create access to those opportunities, I think, is going to affect where RHNA gets allocated. There's also concepts that historically have affected RHNA can no longer be considered when deciding how to allocate the housing need. For example, existing low zoning or having strict growth controls. In the past, that's been a reason to say, well, they can't accommodate their RHNA, so we're not going to give them as much because they have this growth management program. That's no longer the case. The housing now has to be accommodated regardless of that as a constraint. Also, failure to meet the RHNA in the past, and this is in part how jurisdictions like Beverly Hills ended up with a low-income housing distribution in the single digits because they have a historically poor track record of producing affordable housing. So the theory up till now has been allocate more low-income housing to jurisdictions that will actually produce it. But then again, that leads to some jurisdictions having a disproportionately low share of the need to plan for higher density, lower income housing. And the law has now been changed so that the past failure is no longer a factor that goes into determining how RHNA will be allocated. So we can expect to see those jurisdictions that have not met the RHNA in the past getting an increased allocation and being expected to meet that through the new RHNA process. Just an overview of how the RHNA process methodology will work. The COG is going to create a draft methodology and submit that to HCD. HCD will review the methodology for consistency with all the standards that are now in state law. And as was mentioned or implied earlier, that there are a lot of new factors, and the methodology process is a lot more prescriptive than it's been in the past. So I think that there will be less variation between COGs in terms of the methodologies that they come up with for allocating RHNA between their jurisdictions. After HCD reviews the methodology, they will give feedback to the COG, and the COG then has the opportunity to modify or find that its methodology is consistent with state law, notwithstanding HCD's findings, and continue to do the final allocation. I've been talking about COGs here, but there also continues to be the opportunity to have subregions. A subregion is a formal agreement between a county and multiple jurisdictions within that county where they can use the state methodology but come up with their own allocation for RHNA apart from the COG process. But as I mentioned earlier, the RHNA methodology formula is much more prescriptive than it's been in the past. So I think although there's been some jurisdictions that have used subregions in the past and they continue to be allowed to do so, they might have less incentive to do that because the methodology that they'll be using is, again, very prescriptive and is maybe not likely to differ from the methodology that the COG would use. But it does continue to be an option if jurisdictions are interested in doing that.
Just on that note, so we've discussed this here in the SACOG region, and currently there's no counties and the jurisdictions in those counties that are seeking the sub-regional allocation as of right now. If they do, then they would need to let us know by next month, by May.
Oh yeah, thank you for highlighting the deadline on that. But again, some of the incentive for doing that has been reduced by the new methodology. But once the region's overall housing need has been determined, the COG will then complete a draft of the allocation and how it will be distributed between jurisdictions. Any jurisdiction can then appeal that allocation, and HCD also now has the ability to appeal allocation. So there will be some opportunity for back and forth on the distribution process and the decisions that the COG makes in terms of assigning housing to its individual jurisdictions. After the appeal process has completed, the COG will then finalize its determinations and finalize the allocation that's been assigned to each jurisdiction. There is some case law where jurisdictions have challenged the COG's authority for assigning RHNA, and the court decided that that was not a permissible challenge. There can be a lot of political opposition. It can be a contentious process during this, especially during this appeals process. But once the decision is finalized, the COG isn't at risk of being sued and having a court overturn its allocation process to the individual jurisdictions. I mentioned earlier this concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing, and this is a concept that is going to come into play both in the assignment of housing need to individual jurisdictions, and then again in the preparation of the housing element itself. So it's a two-layer obligation. And what affirmatively furthering fair housing means is, I have the quote here on the slide, it's taking meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. What that actually means on the ground is still up for some discussion. HCD has not issued any formal written guidance on what the affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations will mean. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've heard from both legislators, advocates, and HCD staff at different presentations that the expectation is that this will mean both that jurisdictions that have not done a good job of accommodating their lower income housing need in the past, but have high resources, again, either jobs, schools, or other opportunities, can expect to see their RHNAs increase. And then once the RHNA has been assigned, the other expectation that I've heard HCD staff express is that those jurisdictions will have to look at their single-family zoning and consider upzoning and creating new opportunities within their jurisdictions for lower income, high density housing, again, near schools and other employment opportunities and things that will accomplish the goals that are set out here on the slide. The state has identified what they call opportunity zones, and TCAC, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee for the state of California, has prepared comprehensive maps for the entire state that show opportunity areas by census tract. I have the Sacramento region here highlighted on the slide, showing areas where here the dark red are the highest resource areas as determined by TCAC, and those likely will be the types of areas where RHNA allocations will be higher, and then during housing element production, HCD will be looking for higher density, low-income housing opportunities within these zones. So I think, again, too, I'll take one more pause here before we start looking at the specific site inventory requirements and how to accommodate all of this RHNA allocation that we've been discussing. Do we have any comments on the chat yet? No? Great. Okay, so that must mean that this is all just easy and clear and everyone is digesting it. But that's, again, feel free to chime in and ask more specific questions as we're going.
And again, we'll have a period of time at the last half hour-ish or so of this for Q&A. But
for right now, we will continue on and begin focusing on preparing the housing elements themselves and meeting the site inventory requirements. So up till now, we've been talking about some factors that will likely lead to an increase in RHNA that jurisdictions need to accommodate. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, the key piece then of housing element law is creating an inventory and the jurisdictions showing how they will accommodate that need. And the rules around that have changed recently as well. That as part of the 2017 housing package, AB 1397 significantly reworked the criteria for evaluating sites that can be included in the inventory. And the combination of these more strict site inventory requirements with an increasing RHNA load that jurisdictions need to accommodate, again, to me, that will leave jurisdictions with a challenge on how they are going to accommodate and create a legally adequate housing element. So I mentioned it right at the beginning. I'm going to come back to it later, but it's another point to highlight the idea of starting the planning process early. I, again, can't underscore that enough about how important it is to understand what sites you might have available, whether your zoning is adequate, whether rezoning will be required, because there likely will be a need for more housing, more sites, and more rezoning, and you'll need to build appropriate time into your planning process to do that. So specifically what this means, looking at the site inventory requirements, every jurisdiction in its housing element is required to show that the realistic and demonstrated potential of the sites it includes in its housing element inventory. And the potential is the potential to develop over the next 8 years during the planning period. So this has been a focus of HCDs, not letting jurisdictions claim a newly developed Best Buy is going to be a housing element site because, oh, maybe we'll do infill housing on their parking lot. The likelihood of that use turning over in 8 years is potentially low, though as the retail apocalypse continues, maybe it's getting higher. But the burden is going to be on the jurisdiction to show that the uses that they are planning for can be accommodated within the 8 years, and that's a realistic projection. Once they've identified sites, another interesting new requirement is a replacement obligation that goes along with any site that's identified in the housing element inventory that includes existing residential uses and occupied residences. If within the last 5 years, a site in the housing element inventory has residences that were either deed restricted for lower income housing, subject to rent control, or occupied by lower income households, then those units have to be replaced if they're going to be redeveloped, and the replacement requirements are the same as what's included in density bonus law. I'm not going to go through the nitty-gritty of how you replace those right now, but I wanted to put this in the back of everyone's mind too, because it's twofold. On one, the replacement obligation could potentially be a constraint on new housing development. However, it also gives jurisdictions a tool to combat displacement that they don't currently have, particularly because of the Ellis Act. Under state law, the Ellis Act gives property owners the right to go out of the rental housing business, and jurisdictions are very limited in terms of the replacement housing obligations that they can impose on projects. And in some jurisdictions, we're seeing a move for developers to demolish older, higher density housing and replace them with a smaller number of large units because the yield on those is so much higher. They make a profit notwithstanding the loss in units. And this replacement obligation would give jurisdictions a tool to protect that housing stock that they don't currently have. So that's a factor to consider when you're debating what to include in your housing element inventory. However, any sites that are non-vacant are subject to a very specific analysis, and the analysis has the list of factors to analyze to show that a site is a realistic non-vacant site that can develop has expanded over the last 2 years. So you have to specifically analyze when existing uses are an impediment, whether there are development trends that make it likely that those uses will redevelop. But you also have to look at specific jurisdictional factors about prior experience to converting the uses that are on developed sites to higher density residential, as well as analyzing any leases or existing contracts for current use that would potentially keep a project site from redeveloping. So in that made-up Best Buy example that I gave a few minutes ago, if that property owner has a lease to continue their operations for the next 20 years, that's going to preclude you from including it in your housing element site because that lease shows that they intend to continue their operations past the planning period, and it makes it very unlikely that those sites will redevelop. And this non-vacant analysis can get even more complicated depending on what the rest of your housing element inventory looks like. So there's another new requirement that says if more than 50% of the lower income RHNA is being accommodated on non-vacant sites, there's going to be a presumption that those existing uses impede development. And there's very specific findings in the statute that jurisdictions then have to make to overcome that presumption. And the takeaway there is that it's actually going to be very difficult to have an adequate site inventory unless 50% of your sites are vacant. And in developed metropolitan areas, finding sites that are vacant to make up 50% of your RHNA is going to be quite a challenge. So this leaves jurisdictions in a difficult position. Working with a jurisdiction that was preparing its fifth cycle housing element late, I had the experience of HCD requiring letters of property owner interest for all of their non-vacant sites. So jurisdictions will have to potentially identify property owners, assess their interest in redeveloping for higher density housing, and document that in the housing element in order to take credit for their non-vacant sites in their housing element inventory. And then vacant sites themselves aren't necessarily a get out of jail free card either. So I have 3 pictures on the slide here, none of which are considered to be vacant sites for HCD purposes. And if you squint at them, you might have trouble figuring out why. But HCD has taken a very strict definition of what constitutes a vacant site compared to a non-vacant site. So for example, the photo that I have in the lower left of this little montage, there's a parking lot that's at the edge of an undeveloped site. And the site, although it is able to be subdivided, has not yet been subdivided. So despite the fact that the majority of the site is undeveloped and ready for high density residential development, it's not something that counts as a vacant site for purposes of meeting that 50% threshold. The site on the top right, there's an abandoned single-family house in the center of that site. And even though there's no utility hookups, no tenants, no active residential uses for years and years, the fact that there's even that structure there would keep HCD from deciding that the site itself was vacant, despite the fact that the majority of the site is undeveloped and ready for high-density residential housing. One exception to that kind of strict rule is that in an example like this, if the jurisdiction has issued demolition permits, and HCD might be able to be convinced that is then vacant because the use is not expected to continue and the structures will be cleared from the site. But just wanted to highlight these as examples of the level of scrutiny that jurisdictions can be held to when they're claiming sites are either vacant or non-vacant. Also worth mentioning, any agricultural site is not going to be considered a vacant site. That maybe makes a little bit more sense. But sites with power lines or utility easements crossing them, even if they're otherwise undeveloped, may not be considered vacant by HCD. So you'll have to carefully assess whether or not you're able to comply with that 50% threshold. And if not, again, spend a significant amount of time working with property owners and collecting evidence to demonstrate that your non-vacant sites are likely to redevelop during the planning period. There's other restrictions on the ability to use sites in the housing element. For example, previously identified sites in the housing element are now limited in their ability to be reused. If you have a vacant site that's been listed in 2 or more housing elements, it's presumed that it's not going to develop. The same is true for non-vacant sites that have been listed in just 1 housing element. However, you can overcome this presumption by making housing at the density that's required a use by right, and again, attaching that 20% low-income inclusionary requirement to the development. There's also what I've been calling the Goldilocks requirement on size. It can't be too big, it can't be too small. The site has to be just right for affordable housing. So if it's less than half an acre or greater than 10 acres, the site will be presumed to be inappropriate for affordable housing development unless the jurisdiction has substantial evidence to show that it has a track record of producing affordable housing on sites that are outside that range that is assumed to be appropriate. So before I change focus to no net loss, I'll take another pause here and see if we have any other questions that have come in.
Eric actually just came in questions. Can you please clarify when non-vacant sites analysis is necessary?
Sure. So the question was when the non-vacant sites analysis is necessary. So there's 2 levels to it. As you're preparing your housing element inventory, you have to identify whether the sites that are in the inventory are vacant or non-vacant. If for all of your non-vacant sites that you are using for lower income households, you have to analyze them and include an analysis and a discussion of the site development potential using the factors that are highlighted on the slide right now. There's an additional level of analysis that's required if your lower income RHNA, 50% of those sites are accommodated on 50% of your units are being accommodated on non-vacant sites. Then there's a higher threshold that applies, and it's presumed that the existing uses will impede development, and you have to make even more specific findings that are supported by substantial evidence that the uses are likely to be discontinued in the 8-year planning period. So it's regardless of whether you meet this 50% threshold test or not, you have to have some analysis of the capacity of your non-vacant sites, their access to utilities, the likelihood that they'll develop, but the standard for the evidence that needs to be presented goes up, and it becomes harder to justify your reliance on those sites if you don't meet that 50% threshold.
And we have one more question. Can you please review slide 17, previously identified site?
Sure. So I went through this a little quickly, but what this means is that as you look back to your fourth cycle and fifth cycle housing element sites, you might see that your inventories look similar. And a lot of jurisdictions would pick sites, and maybe they were not the most enticing sites to develop, so they continue to be undeveloped or considered available for housing development. So there's the temptation to reuse those sites. And the new requirements from 1397 are trying to limit jurisdictions' ability to do that, so that, again, if there's been a vacant site that's been used in 2 or more housing elements, you're not supposed to reuse it unless the exception I'll talk about in a moment applies. And then the same is true for non-vacant sites, but it's a stricter threshold if you've listed it in 1. So if you have a non-vacant site for lower income housing in your 5th cycle housing element currently, you're not allowed to reuse that in your upcoming 6th cycle housing element unless you rezone the site to allow for the default density, 30 dwelling units per acre, as a use by right. And we talked at the beginning of the presentation about the use by right requirements. So it means that it's not subject to any discretionary review except for design review. However, the design review needs to be based on objective standards so that it does not constitute a project for CEQA purposes. And then the housing is allowed to develop without being subject to CEQA, because it would be non-discretionary and not a project for CEQA purposes. I mentioned also at the beginning the question about what happens if these sites are already used for housing development by right. And I think if they're already used, you can try and continue to reuse them, but I would expect some pushback from HCD about potentially needing additional evidence as to why a site that's already a by right housing site hasn't developed, and why you think in the next 8 years it actually will develop now. That's not explicit in the statutory language, but just from experience working with HCD staff, that's the type of question that will come up if you're trying to reuse a site that has already allowed residential uses by right at the default densities. And if you, in some ways, you're lucky, or it's easier to comply if you haven't been allowing by right, because changing those sites to be residential use by right at the default density would allow you to reuse those older sites.
I think you might have gone over it already, but another question came in. To use vacant sites, to use vacant sites used in 2 prior HEs, that housing must be allowed by right, and there must be a 20% inclusionary requirement. Yes.
Yeah. So this was the question was recapping the discussion that we just had, but that's correct. That non-vacant sites or vacant sites and 2 or more previous housing elements can be reused, but only if they're now allowing housing by right and attached to this 20% low income requirement. So that brings us to the next section of our discussion on the no net loss provisions in section 65863. And I did a similar presentation right after the 2017 housing package was adopted here for SACOG, and we talked about no net loss provisions. But at that time, so if you're a charter city, don't worry about it. You can just you can go get a cup of coffee during this section of the presentation, but that's no longer true because last year SB 1333 changed the applicability of the no net loss provisions, and they now apply to all jurisdictions. General law cities, charter cities, counties are all subject to it. If you were not paying attention to this previously, I suggest that you tune in for the update here. But what the no net loss provisions do is that they apply to any site that was identified in the housing element inventory, and any time one of those sites is either downzoned so that it reduces its site capacity, or approved with a project that's different than what was shown in the housing element inventory, the no net loss provisions kick in, and they require specific findings to be made so that the jurisdiction can demonstrate that it's continuing to have adequate capacity throughout the end of the housing element period for whatever amount of RHNA it has left at that point. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. So this is that same made up site inventory chart I showed at the beginning. And if we look at the first row, we have a site that is zoned to allow up to 30 dwelling units an acre. On the 2-acre site, it was assumed that 40 units would develop, and it was be developed at a high enough density so that we could presume that it was available for lower income households. First, if the city or county decided to downzone that site to R2, R1, or something else so that the residential capacity was reduced, that would trigger no net loss. However, no net loss was also triggered if the jurisdiction were to approve, say, a 35-unit low-income housing development on this site, because then 5 units, you'd be 5 units short from what you showed you were developing. However, it also applies if you don't develop at the exact income level that was shown in the housing elements. Even if you're developing the same number of units or more, you could be developing a 40-unit or even a 50-unit project on this site, but if it's for moderate income or above moderate income households, then you have a shortfall of 40 units for lower income households that needs to be accommodated, and specific findings are required to comply with the no net loss provisions. So what those findings are, it means first you have to find that the reduction is consistent with the general plan and the housing element. So it can't be in conflict with other general plan policies or development standards. And you have to make a finding that the remaining sites in the housing element are adequate for all of the other income levels. And you have to quantify that unmet need and the remaining capacity by income level in the findings themselves. You also then will be required to report that in your following year's annual progress report that goes to HCD. They're due every year on April 1st, and any no net loss findings or calculations or rezonings have to be tracked and reported in those APRs. So you do need to do the calculations up front and have them be part of the findings of project approval. But you will also be held accountable for doing that in the following year's APR. If there are not adequate sites remaining, then you have to identify additional adequate and available sites so that there's no net loss in capacity for development at the income level shown. So with this example that I was talking about, if we've developed a 40-unit above moderate income project on our site, we have to show that we have capacity on other sites for 40 units of lower income housing. I will also mention that it's solely the jurisdiction's responsibility to make the findings here. The developer is not responsible for meeting the income level that's shown in the housing element. So if the developer is proposing 40 units again on this site of above moderate income housing, that's not a basis to deny that developer's project or to increase their affordability requirement. The city or the county is obligated to figure out how to comply with no net loss. And the ways to comply with no net loss, there's 4 options. One is that the remaining sites are adequate. And what this does is it creates a big incentive to create a buffer in your housing element when you're adopting it initially. Because as soon as you start seeing projects that develop at higher income levels and are shown, you're required to comply with the no net loss provisions. If you have a buffer for more lower income sites that are pre-approved, then you were required to just meet your RHNA, you can use those sites to comply and show that those sites continue to be available and they will make up for the difference in the loss of affordability that you have on your initial sites. If you don't have a buffer, showing that the remaining sites in the housing element are adequate is going to be quite a challenge, and you're much more likely to be onto one of the other 3 options. One, you can show that another site was approved with more units at the affordability level. So for example, on that 40-unit site, if you got a tax credit project and actually developed 60 units of lower income housing on that site, then you have a 20-unit surplus that can be used to comply with no net loss going forward on a different site. And then other sites that are not yet in the housing element can be used to make up the difference. And that sites then have to be identified and made available at the proper zoning within 180 days from approving the project and making these no net loss findings. You also then not only need to upzone a site, but make sure that the site that's being upzoned meets all of the site criteria that make it a reasonable site to include in the housing element inventory going forward. Again, doing that in 180 days is a very difficult time period to comply with, and it suggests that doing that legwork up front and having a buffer is probably it's a safer way and a better practice for jurisdictions to plan going forward. So I've said that twice already, and it's so important, I'll say it one more time. Build in a buffer of adequate sites. It really is part of the point of these no net loss provisions. Both the author and the director of HCD have said as much in public that they want jurisdictions upzoning more than the RHNA so that they can comply with no net loss. And I think that even though it's not technically required, you'll have an uphill battle with HCD if you don't have a buffer because they're going to point to these provisions and say you're going to be out of compliance as soon as you approve your first project. Let's take care of it now and build in a buffer. So again, that's really important. But this also is, as I mentioned at the beginning, representative of the increased focus on actual production of housing and of housing at the specific affordability levels. And one way to address that and plan for it is to maximize the inclusionary percentages if you have local inclusionary ordinances. Under AB 1505, you are allowed to have inclusionary for rental housing. You have to provide alternatives for providing on-site rental housing, but you don't always have to allow in lieu fees. You can limit in lieu fees in favor of production of actual affordable housing units, either on-site or off-site. And definitely one thing I'm seeing jurisdictions do is try and increase the amount of affordable housing they require for projects and promote on-site development so that they have a little bit of a buffer to work with for their no net loss findings. And then it becomes really important to maintain appropriate records, especially in large jurisdictions. maybe in charter cities that weren't previously subject to that and that are made up of multiple community planning areas. You might not be keeping your records in this way, but it really is important to demonstrate your compliance with no net loss to have an accurate log of all your housing element sites, all approved development, and at what income level throughout the city, so that you can show whether or not you have a buffer or whether you're in danger of falling behind and need to identify rezoning opportunities. And then we also recommend keeping a record of sites that aren't in the housing element that you might be able to use as available sites later in case you do find yourself in a rezoning or a no net loss position and you've burned through the buffer that we highly recommend that you include. I'm going to just do one more slide and then I'll pause again for questions. I've mentioned HCD a few times throughout this review process. Another change that came from the housing package in 2017 was AB 72, which specifically authorized HCD to revoke housing element compliance mid-cycle and refer violations to the Attorney General. This has been a big focus of the current administration. Governor Newsom is very interested in housing element compliance, and HCD is under a lot of pressure from the governor's office to use their AB 72 authority. They've been very active on this front, even just in the short part of the Newsom administration. So again, I mentioned this to highlight how important it is to work with HCD in identifying sites and providing the analysis and making sure that your housing element is adequate and up to date, because if you don't, you will potentially have a target on your back. If you don't have HCD certification, you could lose access to state funding sources, and it also makes you a target for litigation, either from developers or housing advocates. And the last thing that I'll mention is that this renewed focus on HCD authority and implementation has empowered them to take a very critical look at jurisdictions and their development standards. And my experience with them recently has shown that they're really increasing their focus on objective standards. In the recent housing element update, one of the programs that HCD required was a program to review development standards and remove any non-objective development standards because of their potentially chilling effect on housing development during the planning period. And this is an area where we've seen a lot of attention from other legislators and the housing streamlining bills that I mentioned earlier. So that is going to definitely be a component of the sixth cycle housing element, is identifying how your local development standards are conducive to housing production and whether or not they have non-objective factors that potentially decrease housing development potential. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to talk more about objective standards with the time that we have left. But before I do that, I just want to pause and pick up any other questions.
So we have two new questions, Eric. First one's going to be, how does the lack of developer responsibility for income level square with the prior stated requirement to basically have 20% inclusionary requirement?
Yeah, so the question was some of the underlying tension between not being able to hold developers accountable for providing affordable housing and the need to both comply with no net loss, but also comply with the 20% affordable housing requirements to qualify for streamlining. So in some ways, that 20% threshold to qualify for streamlining as a use by right on housing element sites helps jurisdictions comply with no net loss. So the jurisdiction can't say that a site that's identified for lower income housing has to be 100% low income housing. There's lots of regulatory hurdles to putting a 100% inclusionary requirement on a site like that. Even AB 1505, which lets jurisdictions adopt their own inclusionary requirements, just creates a safe harbor of 15%. So you can do a 15% inclusionary requirement and be safe, but if you go above a 15% inclusionary requirement, HCD can require an economic feasibility study to show that the increased affordability requirement is not a constraint on development. But the by right provisions actually require jurisdictions to have a 20% inclusionary requirement on those certain sites. So that helps with no net loss to a certain extent, because on that 40-unit site that we were using as an example, if a developer wants to invoke the by right requirements, then they have to provide at least 8 of those units as lower income. And that still leaves a 32-unit shortfall, but it's a smaller no net loss obligation than the full 40 units.
We actually had another question that came in, but the second one is HED any less strict about non-vacant sites located in transit priority areas that have been upzoned to comply with the region's SDS under SB 375?
Great, yeah, so the question was how HCD might look at non-vacant sites in infill areas, especially the ones that are consistent with the SCS. And I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the concerns that I have with the new site selection criteria is related to that, is that it seems to run counter to the state's climate goals. It encourages development on more vacant sites, maybe on the urban fringes, and not where we want to be encouraging development for leveraging the investments that we've made in transit and reducing vehicle miles traveled. And that there's an inherent tension in the laws at this point. And I can't say that HCD is going to cut anybody any slack because of that tension. I mean, their hands are a little bit tied. They have to follow the criteria that are set in the statute. So to the extent that there is an inconsistency, it'll be up to the legislature to rectify that. So far, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of that argument hasn't been well received yet by the legislature. I think they want to see how the new RHNA allocation, distribution, and site selection criteria play out before revisiting any of the standards. But it is an underlying tension between the need for housing and the way we're accommodating it while still being reflective of the state's climate goals.
And last question. How much RHNA credit does HCD allow for projected ADU production? Great.
So the question was about projected ADU production and how you can take credit for that in your RHNA. And in some ways, the answer will be dependent on your jurisdiction's experience with developing ADUs and what sort of evidence you have to demonstrate their affordability. So an ADU that does not have a recorded regulatory agreement associated with it is by default just treated like any other housing development. You can assume that ADUs will be developed and maybe show that you're accommodating a portion of your overall housing need with ADUs, but absent any other data, you wouldn't be able to just automatically assume that those would be available for lower income housing. But what I've seen jurisdictions do is conduct surveys and gather data for what the initial rents of ADUs are within their jurisdiction, and then again do owner surveys to see what they're being rented at 1 or 2 years after they've been put into service. And then you can use that survey information and the information you collect at issuance of certificate of occupancy to make assumptions about both how many ADUs will be produced over the next 8 years and at what affordability level. So if you have substantial evidence based on actual rents that 25% of your ADUs are being used for lower income households, and you can project that 100 ADUs are likely to be developed in the next 8 years, you'd have a good argument that your lower income RHNA should be reduced by 25 units because 25 ADUs will come online at that lower income threshold. And again, I've seen that line of analysis and argument be accepted by HCD in housing elements, but you do need to have actual evidence based on your jurisdiction's experience, both producing ADUs and about their affordability level to take that credit.
Thank you.
Eric, one more quick question on no net loss. So you mentioned the 120-day threshold there. I think it is
180.
180. Sorry. So when does that clock start, and then what actually needs to be accomplished in that 180 days? Does the full sort of CEQA review need to happen, or what is that?
Yeah, thank you. Those are both great questions. So the 180-day shot clock, we'll say, is launched from when you make your no net loss findings. So when you're approving a project that requires an upzoning, then your 180-day time period starts once you've approved that project and made those findings. And within those 180 days, you not only have to have identified the site, but you have to have completed the rezoning, and by extension, that means you have to have also completed any CEQA process that goes along with it. So to the extent that it would require, your best bet is, your best case scenario is that it was a site that maybe was available for upzoning and is consistent with your general plan to be upzoned, and you can streamline off of that environmental review and just increase the capacity under the zoning. But if you are in a situation where you're needing to increase capacity under the general plan and the zoning, or if your general plan EIR didn't have a high enough baseline assumption for the site capacity going forward, then you might have to do more focused environmental analysis to comply with CEQA. And 180 days is a tight time frame to comply with a CEQA process. So again, underscoring the need to be proactive and understanding what sites are available, having a buffer. And if your record keeping indicates that you're getting close and maybe you're going to need to do some upzonings soon at your next big project that comes through is going to put you over the edge, start identifying those sites and rezone them in advance so that you have time to do a rezoning and a CEQA process before you're stuck trying to comply with this 180-day time limit. So picking up the thread here, the last topic that we've been talking about were objective standards and the increased focus on objective standards in housing development law in particular. So an objective standard, the first question is trying to figure, well, what is an objective standard anyway? SB 35 has a very specific definition of objective standard. I have it up here on the slide. This definition is not yet incorporated in other areas of the law, though it's helpful to refer back to. And there's one pending bill that would amend the Housing Accountability Act to incorporate this definition as well. So even if it's not in the law yet, we can expect that it will be for purposes that go beyond just SB 35. So it's a helpful starting point to understand what an objective standard is. And it basically means that it has to be a standard that does not involve personal or subjective judgment. It has to be verifiable by reference to an external benchmark, and it has to be knowable by both the applicant and the public and the official before the application is submitted. So what that means is it's something that is in your zoning code, and that's obviously written down. It's a development standard, but it would only be an objective standard if it is, again, uniformly verifiable and doesn't involve subjective judgment. So things like height, setbacks, lot coverage, those are all very easy to quantify as objective standards. A building has to be no more than 45 feet tall. I mean, everyone can agree whether or not that's true. But then you pretty quickly start running into things that I'm sure are in all of your zoning codes right now that are not objective. For example, is a project consistent with the character of the community? Does it promote the health, safety, and welfare of the community? Even one that's required by the Subdivision Map Act. Is the project suitable for the site? None of those are objective for purposes of SB 35 or the Housing Accountability Act because they are not uniformly verifiable and require too much personal and subjective judgment to determine whether or not a project is compliant. And some recent court cases give examples of standards that have been found to not be objective. For example, producing high quality and authentic design, reflecting the look and feel of the community, avoid obstructing views to the surrounding hills. Maybe that's right on the fence, because you could say whether or not a building is blocking views to the hills from a specific point, but the way this is phrased, special care shall be taken, makes it subjective rather than objective, because how do you know whether or not special care has been taken and whether we've avoided obstructing views? But what that highlights for me is the idea that a standard can be objective and still be very specific and controlling. I mean, you could rewrite some of these to be objective standards. You could say that, again, from a particular point, no more than X percent of a view shed can be blocked, and that would likely be objective. Or come up with design standards that are objective, for example, requiring specific pitches, like no more than a 29% pitched roof, or you must use a particular type of tile or specific building materials. You can be very prescriptive in your standards as long as they're written in a way that's objective and an applicant can know whether or not they're complying with them. Where you get into trouble is when you try and leave a little bit of flexibility in order to accommodate unforeseen circumstances. And this does leave, it's a double-edged sword from a developer's perspective, because predictability is helpful. They know the rules going in, but developers also want flexibility because they want to tailor projects and development standards to their individual circumstances, and planners, frankly, like to do that too. So this tilts the scale much more to predictability over flexibility. And I did mention the Subdivision Map Act. There's a published case, this Honcharu case that I have noted here on the slide, that found that some of the statutory required findings in the MAP Act are not objective and therefore can't be used as a basis to deny a project under the Housing Accountability Act. So the site is not physically suitable for the proposed development. Even if you think that that's true, it's not a legal justification under the Housing Accountability Act to deny a housing development application. So then you have to address those MAP Act findings potentially through conditions of approval or other mechanisms so that you can comply with the competing direction from the MAP Act that says you have to make this finding and the Housing Accountability Act that says you can't. So backing up for one moment to give a quick overview of the Housing Accountability Act, it's codified in the Government Code, Section 65589.5. It was first adopted all the way back in 1983, so it's not exactly a new law, but in the last few years, it's gotten a lot more attention and it's been modified and strengthened. So its applicability is much more relevant to planners as you're reviewing projects and potentially approving or denying them. It applies to every housing development project, affordable and non, and it requires that planners review projects for consistency with their objective standards within 30 to 60 days of those projects being deemed complete. If they are consistent with the objective standards, there's very specific findings that are required if you want to deny or reduce the density. And it's very, very difficult to deny any project that's consistent with objective standards. And then there's even a second level of findings for projects that are affordable or emergency shelters, and that those become almost impossible if they meet objective standards. So the only way to deny a project or reduce its density is first to find that it's not consistent with your objective standards. But if it is, then you're left with finding that it would lead to a specific adverse impact to public health and safety, and there's no other way to satisfactorily mitigate that impact. And your standards that are applicable for this review include your general plan, your zoning, your subdivision requirements, and other design review guidelines, anything that's adopted and enforceable and objective against the city. Though I have seen in some cases developers argue that certain guidelines or other documents aren't intended to be binding, so they shouldn't be used for Housing Accountability Act purposes. So we definitely recommend having statements in your guidelines or in your ordinances that make it clear that those are binding development standards, so that to the extent they have objective requirements, you can enforce them. And I'm going to wrap. We have a few minutes left. I'll stop and see if we have any additional questions. But as I'm winding down, I did want to just wrap up with some closing thoughts. I mentioned throughout that it's just really important to begin your process early and be thinking about your need for zoning capacity or your need to have objective standards in your zoning now. And there's SB2 funds that are currently available. HCD has issued their notice of funding availability for that. So to the extent that you're ready, go get some money from the state and start some of your planning activities now, especially if rezonings are going to be required or extensive environmental review is going to be required. I know that here in the SACOG region, there's been good involvement so far with the allocation process. We continue everybody to encourage that. Another strategy that we've seen work in other jurisdictions are strengthening those regional collaboration efforts. For example, in San Mateo County, the 21 Elements group pooled their resources and created certain types of demographic data and analyses together that could be used as a baseline for each of their housing elements, and that streamlines their housing element production. Obviously, their site inventories and the site-specific analyses had to be done by each jurisdiction, but there are opportunities to collaborate and share some of that burden. And as we discussed in some of the question and answer before, CEQA needs to be built into the timeline, especially when rezonings are required. And unfortunately, that also means that CEQA challenges need to be built into your timeline because especially if you're upzoning, if you're putting higher density housing in areas that traditionally have not had it or may be resistant to it, CEQA could be a tool for communities to object to those types of changes. So you need to have time to plan for that and address those concerns while still meeting your obligations under state law. So again, I'll stop there. Thank you everyone for your attention so far, and we'll circle back to any last questions.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. So we have two things. We have a question that came in, and then we'll ask you at the end here is just what's going on with the legislature right now, and are there kind of any big ticket themes that we want to go to? But let's go to the question that came in.
Two questions. You answered one of them already. Just to clarify for the audience, what date did no net loss provision, section 65863, go into effect for charter cities? And it is January 1st, correct, Eric?
Yeah, so it was so no net loss for charter cities became effective as of January 1st this year. It was a bill that was adopted last year.
1 second. So we have a question here. I know we won't have final numbers until fall, but we're in the midst of a general plan update, and it would be enormously helpful to have at least some notion over allocation this summer. Is there any chance SACOG will be able to provide us even with a rough estimate in early summer?
So SACOG will be releasing a menu of methodologies for public review in August. That'll be the earliest time that you'll have any indication. That will, again, have a menu of options with a staff recommendation, and then it won't be official until October. Yeah, you will have your first indication in August.
Thank you. So what's going on with the legislature and kind of big picture themes that jurisdictions need to consider?
Yeah, so right now there are literally hundreds of housing and land use bills that are working their way through the Senate and House right now. One area, I'll start with the negative, one area that is not being addressed so much right now is the RHNA allocation process. I think the legislature and the advocates who are pushing for those changes feel satisfied with where that is at the moment. So most of the bills actually don't touch the housing element processes that we were discussing today. However, there are a lot of efforts to, again, continue the focus on streamlining and upzoning in jurisdictions. SB 50 is one that's getting a lot of the media attention, but there's also SB 4 and AB 1289 that are upzoning bills that would limit single-family exclusive zones and promote higher density near transit in connection with some level of affordability requirement. And each of those bills have slightly different requirements and different mechanisms for doing that, and they are working their way, again, through their various committees right now. The two Senate bills, 50 and SB 4, both passed out of their initial committee, and from what I've heard, the authors, Senator Wiener and Senator McGuire, are discussing amendments to each other's bills that might lead to a shared approach or some aspects of one being incorporated into the other. So it's a little early to say exactly what those bills will look like by the time they make it to their floor votes, but it does seem likely that at least one housing streamlining bill that will encourage or require upzoning near transit and in job centers will make it through the legislature. So that's something that we should be thinking about. There have been other discussions around financing tools. There's potential tax increment financing tool that's being explored that could help finance some of the housing development and the infrastructure needs. I know in some jurisdictions, especially outside of the major metropolitan areas, infrastructure costs are a bigger impediment than zoning requirements. I mean, you can have really high zoning limitations and still not see developers come to build to that level because infrastructure is so expensive and construction costs are so high. So there's some effort to address financing, and I certainly hope that that continues to be discussed. And then the other theme that we see moving through are, again, restrictions on local ability to disincentivize housing projects. So there's a close look happening with the Mitigation Fee Act and ways that that is being used in some jurisdictions potentially to overburden housing projects. ADU legislation continues to be hot in Sacramento. The idea, even though we've seen a big uptick in ADUs over the last few years since the first few bills went into effect, some jurisdictions still aren't approving the right amount of ADUs in the legislature's view and are overburdening them with fees. So we're seeing an effort to continue to relax ADU requirements and limit fees that can be applied to those. And then the last bill that I'll mention is SB 330. It's a bill that Nancy Skinner has authored and passed out of its first committee last week as well. And it's sort of an omnibus housing bill to address issues with the Permit Streamlining Act, with the Housing Accountability Act, and other efforts that, in the legislature's view, local governments use to slow down housing production or make housing production more expensive, and looking for a statewide solution to limit development standards that make housing more expensive to build. And again, there's a lot in that particular bill. There's sections of it that people like, sections of it that people probably don't, and I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to evolve since we're still pretty early in the legislative session. But those are all bills that I'm watching, and the trend, regardless of what individual bill comes out, is that again, the legislature is very interested in removing barriers to production and focused on seeing results in housing, not just paper planning exercises. And hopefully, at least a little bit of recognition that there's some funding necessary to go along with that, because in my view, at least, it's not just local regulations that keep housing development from happening. And we'd like to see more support for the financing and infrastructure to make development more feasible where that's needed as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate your time. And so for those of you that are listening to this on the recording, this is the Housing Element Update webinar. There is AICP credits for legal for today's date, which is April 15, 2019. Again, I want to thank Eric for coming out today. He'll be heading over to the Housing California conference next door in just a few minutes. So hopefully some people, if they see you, they can talk to you then. So really appreciate it, and we'll talk to the SACOG planners in upcoming meetings. Thank you.